The Concept of the Political by Carl Schmitt. Read by Isidore Royer. In memory of my friend, August Schetz of Munich, who fell on August 28, 1917, in the assault on Montcellule. Section 1. The concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political. According to modern linguistic usage, the state is the political status of an organized people in an enclosed territorial unit. This is nothing more than a general paraphrase, not a definition of the state. Since we're concerned here with the nature of the political, such a definition is unwarranted. It may be left open what the state is in its essence: a machine or an organism, a person or an institution, a society or a community, an enterprise or a beehive, or perhaps even a basic procedural order. These definitions and images anticipate too much meaning, too much interpretation, illustration, and construction, and therefore cannot constitute any appropriate point of departure for a simple and elementary statement. In its literal sense and in its historical appearance, the state is a specific entity of a people. Vis-à-vis the many conceivable kinds of entities, it is, in the decisive case, the ultimate authority. More need not be said at this moment. All characteristics of this image of entity and people receive their meaning from the further distinctive trait of the political, and become incomprehensible when the nature of the political is misunderstood. One seldom finds a clear definition of the political. The word is most frequently used negatively in contrast to various other ideas, for example in such antitheses as politics and economy, politics and morality, politics and law, and within law there is again politics and civil law, and so forth. By means of such negative, often also polemical confrontations, it is usually possible, depending upon the context and concrete situation, to characterize something with clarity, but this is still not a specific definition. In one way or another, political is generally juxtaposed to state, or at least is brought into relation with it. The state then appears as something political, the political as something pertaining to the state, obviously an unsatisfactory circle. Many such descriptions of the political appear in professional juridic literature. Insofar as these are not politically polemical, they are of practical and technical interest and are to be understood as legal or administrative decisions in particular cases. These then receive their meaning by the presupposition of a stable state within whose framework they operate. Thus, there exists, for example, a jurisprudence and literature pertaining to the concept of the political club or the political meeting in the law of associations. Furthermore, French administrative law practice has attempted to construct a concept of the political motive with whose aid political acts of government could be distinguished from non-political administrative acts and thereby removed from the control of administrative courts. Such accommodating definitions serve the needs of legal practice. Basically, they provide a practical way of delimiting legal competences of cases within a state in its legal procedures. They do not, in the least, aim at a general definition of the political. Such definitions of the political suffice, therefore, for as long as the state and the public institutions can be assumed as something self-evident and concrete. Also, the general definitions of the political, which contain nothing more than additional references to the state, are understandable and, to that extent, also intellectually justifiable, for as long as the state is truly a clear and unequivocal eminent entity confronting non-political groups and affairs. In other words, for as long as the state possesses the monopoly on politics. That was the case where the state had either, as in the 18th century, not recognized society as an antithetical force, or, at least as in Germany in the 19th and into the 20th, stood above society as a stable and distinct force. The equation state equals politics becomes erroneous and deceptive at exactly the moment when state and society penetrate each other. What had been up to that point affairs of state become thereby social matters, and vice versa, what had been purely social matters become affairs of state, as must necessarily occur in a democratically organized unit. Heretofore ostensibly neutral domains, religion, culture, education, the economy, then cease to be neutral in the sense that they do not pertain to state and to politics. As a polemical concept against such neutralizations and depoliticizations of important domains appears the total state, which potentially embraces every domain. This results in the identity of state and society. In such a state, therefore, everything is at least potentially political, and in referring to the state, it is no longer possible to assert for it a specifically political characteristic. The development can be traced back from the absolute state of the 18th century via the neutral, non-interventionist state of the 19th to the total state of the 20th. Democracy must do away with all the typical distinctions and depoliticizations characteristic of the liberal 19th century, also with those corresponding to the 19th century antitheses and divisions pertaining to the state-society contrast, namely the following, among numerous other thoroughly polemical and thereby again political antitheses: religious, cultural, economic, legal, scientific, all as antitheses of political. The more profound thinkers of the 19th century soon recognized this. In Jakob Burckhardt's Reflections on History of the period around 1870, the following sentences are found on democracy, i.e., a doctrine nourished by 1,000 springs and varying greatly with the social status of its adherents. Only in one respect was it consistent, namely, in the insatiability of its demand for state control of the individual. Thus it blurs the boundaries between state and society, and looks to the state for the things that society will most likely refuse to do, while maintaining a permanent condition of argument and change, and ultimately vindicating the right to work and subsistence for certain castes. Burckhardt also correctly noted the inner contradiction of democracy and the liberal constitutional state. Of these, he says, the state is thus, on the one hand, the realization and expression of the cultural ideas of every party. On the other, merely the visible vestures of civic life and powerful on an ad hoc basis only. It should be able to do everything, yet allowed to do nothing. In particular, it must not even defend its existing form in any crisis. And after all, what men want more than anything else is to participate in the exercise of its power. The state's form thus becomes increasingly questionable and its radius of power ever broader. German political science originally maintained, under the impact of Hegel's philosophy of the state, that the state is qualitatively distinct from society and higher than it. A state standing above society could be called universal, but not total, as that term is understood nowadays, namely as the polemical negation of the neutral state, whose economy and law were in themselves non-political. Nevertheless, after 1848, the qualitative distinction between state and society, to which Lorenz von Stein and Rudolf Neist still subscribed, lost its previous clarity. Notwithstanding certain limitations, reservations, and compromises, the development of German political science, whose fundamental lines were shown in my treatise on Hugo Preuss, follow the historical development toward the democratic identity of state and society. An interesting national liberal intermediary stage is recognizable in the works of Albert Haenel. To generalize the concept of state altogether with the concept of human society is, according to him, a downright mistake. He sees in the state an entity joining other organizations of society, but of a special kind which rises above these and is all-embracing. Although its general purpose is universal, though only in the special task of delimiting and organizing socially effective forces, i.e. in the specific function of the law, Heinel considers wrong the belief that the state has, at least potentially, the power of making all the social goals of humanity its goals too. Even though the state is for him universal, then, it is by no means total. The decisive step is found in Gierke's theory of association, because it conceives of the state as merely one association equal to other associations. Of course, in addition to the associational elements, sovereign ones too belonged to the state and were sometimes stressed more and sometimes less. But since it pertained to a theory of association and not to a theory of sovereignty of the state, the democratic consequences were undeniable. In Germany, they were drawn by Hugo Preuss and Wolzendorf, whereas in England, it led to pluralist theories. While awaiting further enlightenment, it seems to me that Rudolf Smenn's theory of the integration of the state corresponds to a political situation in which society is no longer integrated into an existing state, as the German people in the monarchical state of the 19th century, but should itself integrate into the state. That this situation necessitates the total state is expressed most clearly in Smenn's remark about a sentence from H. Trescher's 1918 dissertation on Montesquieu and Hegel. There, it is said of Hegel's doctrine of the division of powers that it signifies the most vigorous penetration of all social spheres by the state, for the general purpose of winning for the entirety of the state all vital energies of the people. To which Smenn adds that this is precisely the integration theory of his book. In actuality, it is the total state which no longer knows anything absolutely non-political, the state which must do away with the depoliticizations of the 19th century, and which in particular puts an end to the principle that the apolitical economy is independent of the state, and that the state is apart from the economy. Section 2. A definition of the political can be obtained only by discovering and defining the specifically political categories. In contrast to the various, relatively independent endeavors of human thought and action, particularly the moral, aesthetic, and economic, the political has its own criteria, which express themselves in a characteristic way. The political must therefore rest on its own ultimate distinctions to which all action with a specifically political meaning can be traced. Let us assume that in the realm of morality, the final distinctions are between good and evil, in aesthetics, beautiful and ugly, in economics, profitable and unprofitable. The question then is whether there is also a special distinction which can serve as a simple criterion of the political and of what it consists. The nature of such a political distinction is surely different from that of those others. It is independent of them and as such can speak clearly for itself. The specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. This provides a definition in the sense of a criterion, and not as an exhaustive definition or one indicative of substantial content. Insofar as it is not derived from other criteria, the antithesis of friend and enemy corresponds to the relatively independent criteria of other antitheses, good and evil in the moral sphere, beautiful and ugly in the aesthetic sphere, and so on. In any event, it is independent, not in the sense of a distinct new domain, but in that it can neither be based on any one antithesis or any combination of other antitheses, nor can it be traced to these. If the antithesis of good and evil is not simply identical with that of beautiful and ugly, profitable and unprofitable, and cannot be directly reduced to the others, then the antithesis of friend and enemy must even less be confused with or mistaken for the others. The distinction of friend and enemy denotes the utmost degree of intensity of a union or separation, of an association or dissociation. It can exist, theoretically and practically, without having simultaneously to draw upon all those moral, aesthetic, economic, or other distinctions. The political enemy need not be morally evil or aesthetically ugly. He need not appear as an economic competitor, and it may even be advantageous to engage with him in business transactions. But he is, nevertheless, the other, the stranger, and it is sufficient for his nature that he is, in a specially intense way, existentially something different and alien, so that in the extreme case, conflicts with him are possible. These can neither be decided by a previously determined general norm, nor by the judgment of a disinterested and therefore neutral third party. Only the actual participants can correctly recognize, understand, and judge the concrete situation and settle the extreme case of conflict. Each participant is in a position to judge whether the adversary intends to negate his opponent's way of life and therefore must be repulsed or fought in order to preserve one's own form of existence. Emotionally, the enemy is easily treated as being evil and ugly because every distinction, most of all the political, as the strongest and most intense of the distinctions and categorizations, draws upon other distinctions for support. This does not alter the autonomy of such distinctions. Consequently, the reverse is also true. The morally evil, aesthetically ugly, or economically damaging need not necessarily be the enemy. The morally good, aesthetically beautiful, and economically profitable need not necessarily become the friend in the specifically political sense of the word. Thereby, the inherently objective nature and autonomy of the political becomes evident by virtue of its being able to treat, distinguish, and comprehend the friend-enemy antithesis independently of all other antitheses. Section 3. The friend and enemy concepts are to be understood in their concrete and existential sense, not as metaphors or symbols, not mixed and weakened by economic, moral, and other conceptions, least of all in a private individualistic sense as a psychological expression of private emotions and tendencies. They are neither normative nor pure spiritual antitheses. Liberalism, in one of its typical dilemmas of intellect and economics, has attempted to transform the enemy from the viewpoint of economics into a competitor, and from the intellectual point into a debating adversary. In the domain of economics, there are no enemies, only competitors, and in a thoroughly moral and ethical world, perhaps only debating adversaries. It is irrelevant here whether one rejects, accepts, or perhaps finds it an atavistic remnant of barbaric times that nations continue to group themselves according to friend and enemy, or hopes that the antithesis will one day vanish from the world, or whether it is perhaps sound pedagogic reasoning to imagine that enemies no longer exist at all. The concern here is neither with abstractions nor with normative ideals, but with inherent reality and the real possibility of such a distinction. One may or may not share these hopes and pedagogic ideals, but rationally speaking, it cannot be denied that nations continue to group themselves according to the friend and enemy antithesis, that the distinction still remains actual today, and that this is an ever-present possibility for every people existing in the political sphere. The enemy is not merely any competitor or just any partner of a conflict in general. He is also not the private adversary whom one hates. An enemy exists only when, at least potentially, one fighting collectivity of people confronts a similar collectivity. The enemy is solely the public enemy, because everything that has a relationship to such a collectivity of men, particularly to a whole nation, becomes public by virtue of such a relationship. The enemy is hostis, not inimicus in the broader sense, polemos, not εχθρός. As German and many other languages do not distinguish between the private and the political enemy, many misconceptions and falsifications are possible here. The oft-quoted "love your enemies," Matthew 5 verse 44, Luke 6 verse 27, reads "diligite inimicos vestros," and not "diligite hostes vestros." No mention is made of the political enemy. Never in the 1,000-year struggle between Christians and Muslims did it occur to a Christian to surrender rather than defend Europe out of love toward the Saracens or Turks. The enemy in the political sense need not be hated personally, and in the private sphere only does it make sense to love one's enemy, i.e., one's adversary. The Bible quotation touches the political antithesis even less than it intends to dissolve, for example, the antithesis of good and evil, or beautiful and ugly. It certainly does not mean that one should love and support the enemies of one's own people. The political is the most extreme and intense antagonism, and every concrete antagonism becomes that much more political the closer it approaches the most extreme point, that of the friend-enemy grouping. In its entirety, the state as an organized political entity decides for itself the friend-enemy distinction. Furthermore, next to the primary political decisions and under the protection of the decision taken, numerous secondary concepts of the political emanate. As to the equation of politics and state discussed under Section 1, it has the effect, for example, of contrasting a political attitude of a state with party politics, so that one can speak of a state's domestic, religious, educational, communal, social policy, and so on. Notwithstanding, the state encompasses and relativizes all these antitheses. Finally, even more banal forms of politics appear, forms which assume parasite and caricature-like configurations. What remains here from the original friend-enemy grouping is only some sort of antagonistic moment which manifests itself in all sorts of tactics and practices, competitions and intrigues, and the most peculiar dealings and manipulations are called politics. But the fact that the substance of the political is contained in the context of a concrete antagonism is still expressed in everyday language, even where the awareness of the extreme case has been entirely lost. This becomes evident in daily speech and can be exemplified by two obvious phenomena. First, all political concepts, images, and terms have a polemical meaning. They are focused on a specific conflict and are bound to a concrete situation. The result, which manifests itself in war or revolution, is a friend-enemy grouping, and they turn into empty and ghost-like abstractions when this situation disappears. Words such as state, republic, society, class, as well as sovereignty, constitutional state, absolutism, dictatorship, economic planning, neutral or total state, and so on, are incomprehensible if one does not know exactly who is to be affected, combated, refuted, or negated by such a term. Above all, the polemical character determines the use of the word political, regardless of whether the adversary is designated as non-political in the sense of harmless, or vice versa, if one wants to disqualify or denounce him as political in order to portray oneself as non-political in the sense of purely scientific, purely moral, purely juristic, purely aesthetic, purely economic, or on the basis of similar purities, and thereby superior. Secondly, in usual domestic polemics, the word political is today often used interchangeably with party politics. The inevitable lack of objectivity in political decisions, which is the only reflex to suppress the politically inherent friend-enemy antithesis, manifests itself in the regrettable forms and aspects of the scramble for office and the politics of patronage. The demand for depoliticization which arises in this context means only the rejection of party politics, etc. The equation politics equals party politics is possible whenever antagonisms among domestic political parties succeed in weakening the all-embracing political unit, the state. The intensification of internal antagonisms has the effect of weakening the common identity vis-à-vis another state. If domestic conflicts among political parties have become the sole political difference, the most extreme degree of internal political tension is thereby reached, i.e., the domestic, not the foreign friend and enemy groupings, are decisive for armed conflict. The ever-present possibility of conflict must always be kept in mind. If one wants to speak of politics in the context of the primacy of internal politics, then this conflict no longer refers to war between organized nations, but to civil war. 4. To the enemy concept belongs the ever-present possibility of combat. All peripherals must be left aside from this term, including military details and the development of weapons technology. War is armed combat between organized political entities. Civil war is armed combat within an organized unit. A self-laceration endangers the survival of the latter. The essence of a weapon is that it is a means of physically killing human beings. Just as the term enemy, the word combat, too, is understood in its original existential sense. It does not mean competition, nor does it mean pure intellectual controversy, nor symbolic wrestlings, in which, after all, every human being is somehow always involved, for it is a fact that the entire life of a human being is a struggle, and every human being symbolically a combatant. The friend, enemy, and combat concepts receive their real meaning precisely because they refer to the real possibility of physical killing. War follows from enmity. War is the existential negation of the enemy. It is the most extreme consequence of enmity. It does not have to be common, normal, something ideal or desirable, but it must nevertheless remain a real possibility for as long as the concept of the enemy remains valid. It is by no means as though the political signifies nothing but devastating war, and every political deed a military action. By no means as though every nation would be uninterruptedly faced with the friend-enemy alternative vis-à-vis every other nation. And after all, could not the politically reasonable course reside in avoiding war? The definition of the political suggested here neither favors war nor militarism, neither imperialism nor pacifism, nor is it an attempt to idealize the victorious war or the successful revolution as a social ideal, since neither war nor revolution is something social or something ideal. The military battle is itself not the continuation of politics by other means, as the famous term of Clausewitz is generally incorrectly cited. War has its own strategic, tactical, and other rules and points of view, but they all presuppose that the political decision has already been made as to who the enemy is. In war, the adversaries most often confront each other openly. Normally, they are identifiable by a uniform, and the distinction of friend and enemy is therefore no longer a political problem which the fighting soldier has to solve. A British diplomat correctly stated in this context that the politician is better schooled for the battle than the soldier, because the politician fights his whole life, whereas the soldier does so in exceptional circumstances only. War is neither the aim, nor the purpose, nor even the very content of politics, but as an ever-present possibility, it is the leading presupposition which determines in a characteristic way human action and thinking, and thereby creates a specifically political behavior. The criterion of the friend and enemy distinction in no way implies that one particular nation must forever be the friend or enemy of another specific nation, or that a state of neutrality is not possible or could not be politically reasonable. As with every political concept, the neutrality concept too is subject to the ultimate presupposition of a real possibility of a friend and enemy grouping after all. Should only neutrality prevail in the world, then not only war, but also neutrality itself would come to an end. The politics of avoiding war terminates, as does all politics, whenever the possibility of fighting disappears. What always matters is the possibility of the extreme case taking place, the real war, and the decision whether this situation has or has not arrived. That the extreme case appears to be an exception does not negate its decisive character, but confirms it all the more. To the extent that wars today have decreased in number and frequency, they have proportionately decreased in ferocity. War is still today the most extreme possibility. One can say that the exceptional case has an especially decisive meaning here, which exposes the core of the matter. For only in real combat is revealed the most extreme consequence of the political grouping of friend and enemy. From this most extreme possibility, human life derives its specifically political tension. A world in which the possibility of war is utterly eliminated, a completely pacified globe, would be a world without the distinction of friend and enemy, and hence a world without politics. It is conceivable that such a world might contain many very interesting antitheses and contrasts, competitions and intrigues of every kind, but there would not be a meaningful antithesis whereby men could be required to sacrifice life, authorized to shed blood and kill other human beings. For the definition of the political, it is here even irrelevant whether such a world without politics is desirable as an ideal situation. The phenomenon of the political can be understood only in the context of the ever-present possibility of the friend and enemy grouping, regardless of the aspects which this possibility implies for morality, aesthetics, and economics. War, as the most extreme political means, discloses the possibility which underlies every political idea, namely the distinction of friend and enemy. This makes sense only as long as this distinction in mankind is actually present, or at least potentially possible. On the other hand, it would be senseless to wage war for purely religious, purely moral, purely juristic, or purely economic motives. The friend and enemy grouping, and therefore also war, cannot be derived from these specific antitheses of human endeavor. A war need be neither something religious, nor something morally good, nor something lucrative. War today is in all likelihood none of these. This obvious point is mostly confused by the fact that religious, moral, and other antitheses can intensify two political ones and can bring about the decisive friend or enemy constellation. If in fact this occurs, then the relevant antithesis is no longer purely religious, purely moral or economic, but political. The sole remaining question then is always whether such a friend and enemy grouping is really at hand, regardless of which human motives are sufficiently strong to have brought it about. Nothing can escape this logical conclusion of the political. If pacifist hostility toward war were so strong as to drive pacifists into a war against non-pacifists, in a war against war, that would prove that pacifism truly possesses political energy, because it is sufficiently strong to group men according to friend and enemy. If, in fact, the will to abolish war is so strong that it no longer shuns war, then it has become a political motive, i.e., it affirms, even if only as an extreme possibility, war, and even the reason for war. Presently, this appears to be a peculiar way of justifying wars. The war is then considered to constitute the absolute last war of humanity. Such a war is necessarily unusually intense and inhuman, because by transcending the limits of the political framework, it simultaneously degrades the enemy into moral and other categories, and is forced to make of him a monster that must not only be defeated, but also utterly destroyed. In other words, he is an enemy who no longer must be compelled to retreat into his borders only. The ultimate feasibility of such war is particularly illustrative of the fact that war as a real possibility is still present today, and this fact is crucial for the friend and enemy antithesis, and for the recognition of politics. Section 4. Every religious, moral, economic, ethical, or other antithesis transforms itself into a political one if it is sufficiently strong to group human beings effectively according to friend and enemy. The political does not reside in the battle itself, which possesses its own technical, psychological, and military laws, but in the mode of behavior which is determined by this possibility, by clearly evaluating the concrete situation and thereby being able to distinguish correctly the real friend and the real enemy. A religious community which wages wars against members of other religious communities, or engages in other wars, is already more than a religious community. It is a political entity. It is a political entity when it possesses, even if only negatively, the capacity of promoting that decisive step, when it is in the position of forbidding its members to participate in wars, i.e., of decisively denying the enemy quality of a certain adversary. The same holds true of an association of individuals based on economic interests, as, for example, an industrial concern or a labor union. Also, a class, in the Marxian sense, ceases to be something purely economic and becomes a political factor when it reaches this decisive point. For example, when Marxists approach the class struggle seriously and treat the class adversary as a real enemy, and fights him either in the form of a war of state against state or in a civil war within a state. The real battle is then, of necessity, no longer fought according to economic laws, but has, next to the fighting methods in the narrowest technical sense, its political necessities and orientations, coalitions and compromises, and so on. Should the proletariat succeed in seizing political power within a state, a proletarian state will thus have been created. This state is by no means less of a political power than a national state, a theocratic, mercantile, or soldier state, a civil service state, or some other type of political entity. Were it possible to group all mankind in the proletarian and bourgeois antithesis, as friend and enemy in proletarian and capitalist states, and if in the process all other friend and enemy groupings were to disappear, the total reality of the political would then be revealed, insofar as concepts which at first glance had appeared to be purely economic turn into political ones. If the political power of a class or of some other group within a state is sufficiently strong to hinder the waging of wars against other states, but incapable of assuming or lacking the will to assume the state's power and thereby decide on the friend and enemy distinction and if necessary make war, then the political entity is destroyed. The political can derive its energy from the most varied human endeavors, from the religious, economic, moral, and other antitheses. It does not describe its own substance, but only the intensity of an association or dissociation of human beings, whose motives can be religious, national, in the ethnic or cultural sense, economic, or of another kind, and can affect at different times different coalitions and separations. The real friend-enemy grouping is existentially so strong and decisive that the non-political antithesis, at precisely the moment at which it becomes political, pushes aside and subordinates its hitherto purely religious, purely economic, purely cultural criteria and motives to the conditions and conclusions of the political situation at hand. In any event, that grouping is always political, which orients itself toward this most extreme possibility. This grouping is therefore always the decisive human grouping, the political entity. If such an entity exists at all, it is always the decisive entity, and it is sovereign in the sense that the decision about the critical situation, even if it is the exception, must always necessarily reside there. A valid meaning is here attached to the word sovereignty, just as to the term entity. Both do not at all imply that a political entity must necessarily determine every aspect of a person's life, or that a centralized system should destroy every other organization or corporation. It may be that economic considerations can be stronger than anything desired by a government which is ostensibly indifferent toward economics. Likewise, religious convictions can easily determine the politics of an allegedly neutral state. What always matters is only the possibility of conflict. If, in fact, the economic, cultural, or religious counter-forces are so strong that they are in a position to decide upon the extreme possibility from their viewpoint, then these forces have in actuality become the new substance of the political entity. It would be an indication that these counterforces had not reached the decisive point in the political if they turned out to be not sufficiently powerful to prevent a war contrary to their interests or principles. Should the counterforces be strong enough to hinder a war desired by the state that was contrary to their interests or principles, but not sufficiently capable themselves of deciding about war, then a unified political entity would no longer exist. However one may look at it, in the orientation toward the possible extreme case of an actual battle against a real enemy, the political entity is essential, and it is the decisive entity for the friend or enemy grouping. And in this, and not in any kind of absolutist sense, it is sovereign. Otherwise, the political entity is non-existent. When the political significance of domestic economic associations had been recognized, in particular the growth of labor unions, the laws of the state appeared quite powerless against their economic weapon, the strike. Consequently, some have somewhat hastily proclaimed the death and end of the state. As far as I can tell, this emerged as a doctrine of the French syndicalists after 1906 and 1907. Duguay is in this context the best-known political theorist. Ever since 1901, he has tried to refute the conception of sovereignty and the conception of the personality of the state with some accurate arguments against an uncritical metaphysics of the state and personifications of the state, which are, after all, only remnants from the world of princely absolutism, but in essence miss the actual political meaning of the concept of sovereignty. Similarly, this also holds true for J.D.H. Cole's and Harold Laski's so-called theory of pluralism, which appeared somewhat later in the Anglo-Saxon world. Their pluralism consists in denying the sovereignty of the political entity, by stressing time and again that the individual lives in numerous different social entities and associations. He is a member of a religious institution, nation, labor union, family, sports club, and many other associations. These control him in differing degrees from case to case and impose on him a cluster of obligations in such a way that no one of these associations can be said to be decisive and sovereign. On the contrary, each one in a different field may prove to be the strongest, and then the conflict of loyalties can only be resolved from case to case. It is conceivable, for example, that a labor union should decide to organize its members no longer to attend church, but in spite of it they continue to do so, and that simultaneously a demand by the church that members leave the labor union remain likewise unheeded. Particularly striking in this example is the coordination of religious associations and labor unions, which could result in an alliance because of their common antipathy toward the state. This is typical of the pluralism which appears in the Anglo-Saxon countries. Its main theoretical point of departure was, next to Gierke's association theory, J. Neville Figgis's book on churches in the modern state. Hence, the historical context to which Lasky always returns, and which obviously made a great impression on him, is the simultaneous and equally unsuccessful attacks of Bismarck against the Catholic Church and the Socialists. In the Kulturkampf against the Roman Church, it was seen that even a state of the unimpaired strength of Bismarck's Reich was not absolutely sovereign and powerful. This state was equally unsuccessful in its battle against the socialist working class. Would this state have been sufficiently strong in the economic domain to remove from the labor unions their power to strike? This critique is largely justified. The juridic formulas of the omnipotence of the state are in fact only superficial secularizations of theological formulas of the omnipotence of God. Also, the 19th century German doctrine of the personality of the state is important here, because it was in part a polemical antithesis to the personality of the absolute prince, and in part to a state considered as a higher third vis-à-vis all other social groups, with the aim of evading the dilemma of monarchical or popular sovereignty. But the question remains unanswered. Which social entity, if I am permitted to use here the imprecise liberal concept of social, determines the extreme case and the decisive friend and enemy grouping? Neither a church, nor a labor union, nor an alliance of both could have forbidden or prevented a war which the German Reich might have wanted to wage under Bismarck. He could not declare war against the Pope, but only because the Pope no longer possessed the jus belli, and also the socialist labor unions did not want to appear in the role of a parti belligerante. In any event, no organized opposition then imaginable could have possibly deprived the German government of making the relevant decision in the extreme case. Such an opposition would have risked being treated as an enemy, and would thus have been affected by all the consequences of this concept. Furthermore, neither the church nor a labor union was prepared to engage in a civil war. These considerations are sufficient to establish a reasonable concept of sovereignty and entity. The political entity is by its very nature the decisive entity, regardless of the sources from which it derives its last psychic motives. It exists or does not exist. If it exists, it is the supreme, that is, in the decisive case, the authoritative entity. That the state is an entity and, in fact, the decisive entity rests upon its political character. A pluralist theory can only ever be either the theory of state which arrives at the unity of the state by a federalism of social associations, or a theory of a dissolution or rebuttal of the state. If in fact it challenges the entity and places the political association on an equal level with the others, for example, religious or economic associations, it must above all answer the question as to the specific content of the political. Although in his numerous books Lasky speaks of state, politics, sovereignty, and government, one does not find in these a specific definition of the political. The state simply transforms itself into an association which competes with other associations. It becomes a society among some other societies which exist within or outside the state. That is the pluralism of this theory of state. Its entire ingenuity is directed against earlier exaggerations of the state, against its majesty and its personality, against its claim to possess the monopoly of the highest unity, while it remains unclear what, according to this pluralist theory of state, the political entity should be. At times it appears in its old liberal form as a mere servant of the essentially economically determined society, at times pluralistically as a distinct type of society, that is, as one association among other associations, at times as the product of a federalism of social associations or an umbrella association of a conglomeration of associations. Above all, though, it has to be explained why human beings should have to form a governmental association, in addition to the religious, cultural, economic, and other associations, and what would be its specific political meaning. No clear chain of thought is discernible here. What appears, finally, is an all-embracing, monistically global, and by no means pluralist concept, namely Cole's society and Lasky's humanity. The pluralist theory of state is in itself pluralistic, that is, it has no center, but draws its thoughts from rather different intellectual circles, religion, economics, liberalism, socialism, etc. It ignores the central concept of every theory of state, the political, and it does not even mention the possibility that the pluralism of associations could lead to a federally constituted political entity. It totally revolves in a liberal individualism. The result is nothing else than irrevocable service for individuals and their free associations. One association is played off against another, and all questions and conflicts are decided by individuals. In reality, there exists no political society or association, but only one political entity, one political community. The ever-present possibility of a friend and enemy grouping suffices to forge a decisive entity which transcends the mere societal associational groupings. The political entity is something specifically different, and vis-a-vis other associations, something decisive. Were this entity to disappear, even if only potentially, then the political itself would disappear. Only as long as the essence of the political is not comprehended or not taken into consideration is it possible to place a political association pluralistically on the same level with religious, cultural, economic, or other associations, and permit it to somehow compete with these. As we shall attempt to show, the concept of the political yields pluralistic consequences, but not in the sense that within one and the same political entity, instead of the decisive friend and enemy grouping, a pluralism could take its place without destroying the entity and the political itself. Section 5. To the state, as an essentially political entity, belongs the ius belli, i.e., the real possibility of deciding in a concrete situation upon the enemy, and the ability to fight him with the power emanating from the entity. As long as a politically united group is prepared to fight for its existence, independence, and freedom on the basis of a decision emanating from the political entity, this specifically political question has primacy over the technical means by which the battle will be waged, the nature of the army's organization, and what the prospects are for winning the war. The development of military techniques appears to move in a direction which will perhaps permit only a few states to survive, i.e., those whose industrial potential would allow them to wage a promising war. Should smaller and weaker states be unable to maintain their independence by virtue of an appropriate alliance, then they may be forced, voluntarily or by necessity, to abdicate the ius belli. This development would still not prove that war, state, and politics will altogether cease. The numerous changes and revolutions in human history and development have produced new forms and dimensions of political groupings. Previously existing political structures were destroyed, new kinds of foreign and civil war arose, and the number of organized political entities soon increased or diminished. The state, as the decisive political entity, possesses an enormous power, the possibility of waging war and thereby publicly disposing of the lives of men. The ius belli contains such a disposition. It implies a double possibility, the right to demand from its own members the readiness to die, and unhesitatingly to kill enemies. The endeavor of a normal state consists above all in assuring total peace within the state and its territory, to create tranquility, security, and order, and thereby establish the normal situation, is the prerequisite for legal norms to be valid at all. Every norm presupposes a normal situation, and no norm can be valid in an entirely abnormal situation. As long as the state is a political entity, this requirement for internal peace compels it in critical situations to decide also upon the domestic enemy. Every state provides, therefore, some kind of formula for the declaration of an internal enemy. The polemos declaration in the public law of the Greek republics and the hostis declaration in Roman public law are but two examples. Whether the form is sharper or milder, explicit or implicit, whether ostracism, expulsion, proscription, or outlawry are provided for in special laws or in explicit or general descriptions, the aim is always the same, namely, to declare an enemy. That, depending on the attitude of those who had been declared enemies of state, is possibly the sign of civil war, i.e., the dissolution of the state as an organized political entity, internally peaceful, territorially enclosed, and impenetrable to aliens. The civil war then decides the further fate of this entity. More so than for other states, this is particularly valid for a constitutional state, despite all the constitutional ties to which the state is bound. In a constitutional state, as Lorenz von Stein says, the constitution is the expression of the social order, the existence of society itself. As soon as it is attacked, the battle must then be waged outside the constitution and the law, hence decided by the power of weapons. The authority to decide, in the form of a verdict on life and death, the ius vitae ac necis, can also belong to another non-political order within the political entity, for instance, to the family or to the head of the household, but not the right of a hostis declaration as long as the political entity is in actuality and possesses the ius belli. If a political entity exists at all, the right of vendettas between families or kinsfolk would have to be suspended, at least temporarily, during a war. A human group which renounces these consequences of a political entity ceases to be a political group, because it thereby renounces the possibility of deciding whom it considers to be the enemy and how he should be treated. By virtue of this power over the physical life of men, the political community transcends all other associations or societies. Within the community, however, subordinate groupings of a secondary political nature can exist with their own or transferred rights, even with a limited ius vitae ac necis over members of smaller groups. A religious community, for instance, a church, can exhort a member to die for his belief and become a martyr, but only for the salvation of his own soul, not for the religious community in its quality as an earthly power. Otherwise, the Church assumes a political dimension. Its holy wars and crusades are actions which presuppose an enemy decision, just as do other wars. To take another example, under no circumstances can anyone demand that any member of an economically determined society, whose order in the economic domain is based upon rational procedures, sacrifice his life in the interest of rational operations. To justify such a demand on the basis of economic expediency would contradict the individualistic principles of a liberal economic order and would never be justified by the norms or ideals of an economy autonomously conceived. The individual may die voluntarily for whatever reason he may wish. That is, like everything in an essentially individualistic liberal society, a thoroughly private matter, decided upon freely. The economically functioning society possesses sufficient means to neutralize non-violently, in a peaceful fashion, those economic competitors who are inferior, unsuccessful, or mere perturbers. Concretely speaking, this implies that this competitor will be left to starve if he does not voluntarily accommodate himself. A purely cultural or civilized system of society will not lack social indications to rid itself of unwanted perturbations or unwanted additions. But no program, no ideal, no norm, no expediency confers a right to dispose of the physical life of other human beings, to demand seriously of human beings that they kill others and be prepared to die themselves so that trade and industry may flourish for the survivors, or that the purchasing power of grandchildren may grow, is sinister and crazy. It is a manifest fraud to condemn war as homicide and then demand of men that they wage war, kill and be killed, so that there will never again be war. War, the readiness of combatants to die, the physical killing of human beings who belong on the side of the enemy, all this has no normative meaning, but an existential meaning only, particularly in a real combat situation with a real enemy. There exists no rational purpose, no norm, no matter how true, no program, no matter how exemplary, no social ideal, no matter how beautiful, no legitimacy nor legality, which could justify men in killing each other for this reason. If such physical destruction of human life is not motivated by an existential threat to one's own way of life, then it cannot be justified. Just as little can war be justified by ethical and juristic norms. If there really are enemies in the existential sense, as meant here, then it is justified, but only politically, to repel and fight them physically. That justice does not belong to the concept of war has been generally recognized since Grotius. Indeed, the notions which postulate a just war usually serve a political purpose. To demand of a politically unified group that it wage war for a just cause only is either something self-evident, if it means that war can be risked only against a real enemy, or it is a hidden political aspiration of some other party to wrest from the state its ius belli, and to find norms of justice whose content and application in the concrete case is not decided upon by the state, but by another party, and thereby it determines who the enemy is. For as long as a people exists in the political sphere, this people must, even if only in the most extreme case, and whether this point has been reached has to be decided by it, determine by itself the distinction of friend and enemy. Therein resides the essence of its political existence. When it no longer possesses the capacity or the will to make this distinction, it ceases to exist politically. If it permits this decision to be made by another, then it is no longer a politically free people and is absorbed into another political system. The justification of war does not reside in its being fought for ideals or norms of justice, but in its being fought against a real enemy. All confusions of this category of friend and enemy can be explained as results of blendings of some sort of abstractions or norms. A people which exists in the sphere of the political cannot, in case of need, renounce the right to determine by itself the friend and enemy distinction. It can solemnly declare that it condemns war as a means of solving international disputes, and can renounce it as a means of national policy, as was done in the so-called Kellogg Pact of 1928. In doing so, it has neither repudiated war as an instrument of international politics, and a war as an instrument of international politics can be worse than a war as an instrument of national policy only, nor condemned nor outlawed war altogether. Such a declaration is subject, first of all, to specific reservations which are explicitly or implicitly self-understood, as, for example, the reservation regarding the autonomous existence of the state and its self-defense, the reservation regarding existing treaties, the right of a continuing free and independent existence, and so on and so forth. Second, these reservations are, according to their logical structure, no mere exceptions to the norm, but altogether give the norm its concrete content. They are not peripheral, but essential exceptions. They give the treaty its real content in dubious cases. Third, as long as a sovereign state exists, this state decides for itself, by virtue of its independence, whether or not such a reservation, self-defense, enemy aggression, violation of existing treaties, including the Kellogg Pact and so on, is or is not given in the concrete case. Fourth, war cannot altogether be outlawed, but only specific individuals, peoples, states, classes, religions, etc., which, by being outlawed, are declared to be the enemy. The solemn declaration of outlawing war does not abolish the friend-enemy distinction, but on the contrary, opens new possibilities by giving an international enemy declaration new content and new vigor. Were this distinction to vanish, then political life would vanish altogether. A people which exists in the political sphere cannot, despite entreating declarations to the contrary, escape from making this fateful distinction. If a part of the population declares that it no longer recognizes enemies, then depending on the circumstance, it joins their side and aids them. Such a declaration does not abolish the reality of the friend and enemy distinction. Quite another question concerns citizens of a state who declare that they personally have no enemies. A private person has no political enemies. Such a declaration can at most say that he would like to place himself outside the political community to which he belongs and continue to live as a private individual only. Furthermore, it would be a mistake to believe that a nation could eliminate the distinction of friend and enemy by declaring its friendship for the entire world or by voluntarily disarming itself. The world will not thereby become depoliticized, and it will not be transplanted into a condition of pure morality, pure justice, or pure economics, as liberals might dream. If a people is afraid of the trials and risks implied by existing in the sphere of politics, then another people will appear, which will assume these trials by protecting it against foreign enemies and thereby taking over political rule. The protector then decides who the enemy is by virtue of the eternal relation of protection and obedience. On this principle rests the feudal order and the relation of lord and vassal, leader and led, patron and clients. This relation is clearly and explicitly seen here. No form of order, no reasonable legitimacy or legality can exist without protection and obedience. The protego ergo obligo is the cogito ergo sum of the state. A political theory which does not systematically become aware of this sentence remains an inadequate fragment. Hobbes designated this, at the end of his English edition of 1651, page 396, as the true purpose of his Leviathan, to instill in man once again the mutual relation between protection and obedience. Human nature, as well as divine right, demands its inviolable observation. Hobbes himself had experienced this truth in the terrible times of civil war, because then all legitimate and normative illusions with which men like to deceive themselves regarding political realities in periods of untroubled security vanish. If within the state there are organized parties capable of according their members more protection than the state, then the latter becomes at best an annex of such parties, and the individual citizen knows whom he has to obey. As has been shown, a pluralistic theory of state can justify this. The fundamental correctness of the protection-obedience axiom comes to the fore even more clearly in foreign policy and interstate relations. The simplest expression of this axiom is found in the protectorate under international law, the federal state, the confederation of states dominated by one of them, and the various kinds of treaties offering protection and guarantees. It would be ludicrous to believe that a defenseless people has nothing but friends, and it would be a deranged calculation to suppose that the enemy could perhaps be touched by the absence of a resistance. No one thinks it possible that the world could, for example, be transformed into a condition of pure morality by the renunciation of every aesthetic or economic productivity. Even less can a people hope to bring about a purely moral or purely economic condition of humanity by evading every political decision. If a people no longer possesses the energy or the will to maintain itself in the sphere of politics, the latter will not thereby vanish from the world. Only a weak people will disappear. Section 6. The political entity presupposes the real existence of an enemy, and therefore coexistence with another political entity. As long as a state exists, there will thus always be in the world more than just one state. A world state, which embraces the entire globe and all of humanity, cannot exist. The political world is by definition a pluriverse, not a universe. In this sense, every theory of state is pluralistic, even though in a different way from the domestic theory of pluralism discussed in Section 4. The political entity cannot by its very nature be universal in the sense of embracing all of humanity and the entire world. If the different states, religions, classes, and other human groupings on earth should be so unified that a conflict among them is impossible and even inconceivable, and if civil war should forever be foreclosed in a realm which embraces the globe, then the distinction of friend and enemy would also cease. What remains is neither politics nor state, but culture, civilization, economics, morality, law, art, entertainment, etc. If and when this condition will appear, I do not know. At the moment, this is not the case, and it is self-deluding to believe that the termination of a modern war would lead to world peace, thus setting forth the idyllic goal of complete and final depoliticization, simply because a war between the great powers today may easily turn into a world war. Humanity as such cannot wage war because it has no enemy, at least not on this planet. The concept of humanity excludes the concept of the enemy, because the enemy does not cease to be a human being, and hence there is no specific differentiation in that concept. That wars are waged in the name of humanity is not a contradiction of this simple truth. Quite the contrary, it has an especially intensive political meaning. When a state fights its political enemy in the name of humanity, it is not a war for the sake of humanity, but a war wherein a particular state seeks to usurp a universal concept against its military opponent. At the expense of its opponent, it tries to identify itself with humanity in the same way as one can misuse peace, justice, progress, and civilization in order to claim these as one's own and to deny the same to the enemy. The concept of humanity is an especially useful ideological instrument of imperialist expansion, and in its ethical humanitarian form, it is a specific vehicle of economic imperialism. Here, one is reminded of a somewhat modified expression of Proudhon's: whoever invokes humanity wants to cheat. To confiscate the word humanity, to invoke and monopolize such a term, probably has certain incalculable effects, such as denying the enemy the quality of being human and declaring him to be an outlaw of humanity, and a war can thereby be driven to the most extreme inhumanity. But beside this highly political utilization of the non-political term humanity, there are no wars of humanity as such. Humanity is not a political concept, and no political entity or society and no status corresponds to it. The 18th century humanitarian concept of humanity was a polemical denial of the then existing aristocratic feudal system and the privileges accompanying it. Humanity, according to natural law and liberal individualistic doctrines, is a universal, i.e., all-embracing social ideal, a system of relations between individuals. This materializes only when the real possibility of war is precluded and every friend and enemy grouping becomes impossible. In this universal society, there would no longer be nations in the form of political entities, no class struggles, and no enemy groupings. The League of Nations idea was clear and precise as long as such a body could be construed as a polemical antithesis of a League of Monarchs. It was in this context that the German word Völkerbund originated in the 18th century. But this polemical meaning disappeared with the political significance of monarchy. A Völkerbund could moreover serve as an ideological instrument of the imperialism of a state or a coalition of states against other states. This would then confirm all that has been said previously concerning the political use of the term humanity. For many people, the ideal of a global organization means nothing else than the utopian idea of total depoliticization. Demands are therefore made, almost always indiscriminately, that all states on Earth become members as soon as possible and that it be universal. Universality at any price would necessarily have to mean total depoliticization, and with it, particularly, the non-existence of states. As a result of the 1919 Paris peace treaties, an incongruous organization came into existence, the Geneva Establishment, which is called in German Völkerbund, in French Société des Nations, and English the League of Nations, but should properly be called a Society of Nations. This body is an organization which presupposes the existence of states, regulates some of their mutual relations, and even guarantees their political existence. It is neither universal nor even an international organization. If the German word for international is used correctly and honestly, it must be distinguished from interstate and applied instead to international movements which transcend the borders of states and ignore the territorial integrity, impenetrability, and impermeability of existing states, as, for example, the Third Internationale. Immediately exposed here are the elementary antitheses of international and interstate, of a depoliticized universal society, and interstate guarantees of the status quo of existing frontiers. It is hard to comprehend how a scholarly treatment of the League of Nations could skirt this, and even lend support to this confusion. The Geneva League of Nations does not eliminate the possibility of wars, just as it does not abolish states. It introduces new possibilities for wars, it permits wars to take place, sanctions coalition wars, and by legitimizing and sanctioning certain wars, it sweeps away many obstacles to war. As it has existed so far, it is under specific circumstances a very useful meeting place, a system of diplomatic conferences which meet under the name of the League of Nations Council and the Assembly of the League of Nations. These bodies are linked to a technical bureau, that of the Secretariat. As I've already shown elsewhere, this establishment is not a league, but possibly an alliance. The genuine concept of humanity is expressed in it only insofar as its actual activities reside in the humanitarian and not in the political field, and only as an interstate administrative community does it at least have a tendency toward a meaningful universality. But in view of the League's true constitution, and because this so-called League still enables wars to be fought, even this tendency is an ideal postulate only. A League of Nations which is not universal can only be politically significant when it represents a potential or actual alliance, i.e. a coalition. The ius belli would not thereby be abolished, but more or less, totally or partially transferred to the alliance. A League of Nations as a concrete existing universal human organization would on the contrary have to accomplish the difficult task of first, effectively taking away the ius belli from all the still existing human groupings, and second, simultaneously not assuming the ius belli itself. Otherwise, universality, humanity, depoliticized society, in short, all essential characteristics, would again be eliminated. Were a world state to embrace the entire globe and humanity, then it would no longer be a political entity, and would only be loosely called a state. If, in fact, all humanity and the entire world were to become a unified entity based exclusively on economics and on technically regulating traffic, then it still would not be more of a social entity than a social entity of tenants in a tenement house, customers purchasing gas from the same utility company, or passengers traveling on the same bus. An interest group concerned exclusively with economics or traffic cannot become more than that in the absence of an adversary. Should that interest group also want to become cultural, ideological, or otherwise more ambitious, and yet remain strictly non-political, then it would be a neutral consumer or producer cooperative moving between the poles of ethics and economics. It would know neither state nor kingdom nor empire, neither republic nor monarchy, neither aristocracy nor democracy, neither protection nor obedience, and would altogether lose its political character. The acute question to pose is upon whom will fall the frightening power implied in a world-embracing economic and technical organization. This question can by no means be dismissed in the belief that everything would then function automatically, that things would administer themselves, and that a government by people over people would be superfluous because human beings would then be absolutely free. For what would they be free? This can be answered by optimistic or pessimistic conjectures, all of which finally lead to an anthropological profession of faith. Section 7. One could test all theories of state and political ideas according to their anthropology, and thereby classify these as to whether they consciously or unconsciously presuppose man to be by nature evil or by nature good. The distinction is to be taken here in a rather summary fashion, and not in any specifically moral or ethical sense. The problematic or unproblematic conception of man is decisive for the presupposition of every further political consideration, the answer to the question whether man is a dangerous being or not, a risky or a harmless creature. The numerous modifications and variations of this anthropological distinction of good and evil are not reviewed here in detail. Evil may appear as corruption, weakness, cowardice, stupidity, or also as brutality, sensuality, vitality, irrationality, and so on. Goodness may appear in corresponding variations as reasonableness, perfectibility, the capacity of being manipulated, of being taught, peaceability, and so forth. Striking in this context is the political significance of animal fables. Almost all can be applied to a real political situation. The problem of aggression in the fable of the wolf and the lamb, the question of guilt for the plague in La Fontaine's fable, a guilt which of course falls upon the donkey, justice between states in the fable of animal assemblies, disarmament in Churchill's election speech of October 1928, which depicts how every animal believes that its teeth, claws, horns are only instruments for maintaining peace, the large fish which devour the small ones, etc. This curious analogy can be explained by the direct connection of political anthropology with what the political philosophers of the 17th century, Hobbes, Spinoza, Pufendorf, called the state of nature. In it, states exist among themselves in a condition of continual danger, and their acting subjects are evil for precisely the same reasons as animals who are stirred by their drives, hunger, greediness, fear, jealousy. It is unnecessary to differ with Wilhelm Dilthey. Man, according to Machiavelli, is not by nature evil. Some places seem to indicate this. But what Machiavelli wants to express everywhere is that man, if not checked, has an irresistible inclination to slide from passion to evil. Animality, drives, passions are the kernels of human nature, above all, love and fear. Machiavelli is inexhaustible in his psychological observations of the play of passions. From this principal feature of human life, he derives the fundamental law of all political life. In the chapter Der Machtmensch in Lebensformen, Edward Spranger says, "For the politician, the science of man is naturally of prime interest. It appears to me, however, that Spranger takes too technical a view of this interest, as interest in the technical manipulation of instinctive drives. In the further elaboration of this chapter, which is crammed full of ideas and observations, there can be recognized time and time again the specifically political phenomena and the entire existentiality of the political. For example, the sentence, "The dignity of power appears to grow with its sphere of influence," relates to a phenomenon which is rooted in the sphere of the political and can therefore be understood only politically. It is, to be sure, applicable to the following thesis. The weight of the political is determined by the intensity of alignments according to which the decisive associations and dissociations adjust themselves. Also, Hegel's proposition concerning the dialectical change of quantity into quality is comprehensible in the context of political thought only. Helmuth Plessner, who as the first modern philosopher in his book Power and Human Nature dared to advance a political anthropology of a grand style, correctly says that there exists no philosophy and no anthropology which is not politically relevant, just as there is no philosophically irrelevant politics. He has recognized in particular that philosophy and anthropology, as specifically applicable to the totality of knowledge, cannot, like any specialized discipline, be neutralized against irrational life decisions. Man, for Plessner, is primarily a being capable of creating distance, who in his essence is undetermined, unfathomable, and remains an open question. If one bears in mind the anthropological distinction of evil and good and combines Plessner's remaining open with his positive reference to danger, Plessner's theory is closer to evil than to goodness. This thesis coincides with the fact that Hegel and Nietzsche, too, belong on the side of evil. And finally, power itself, according to Burckhardt's well-known and by no means unambiguous expression, is also something evil. I have pointed out several times that the antagonism between the so-called authoritarian and anarchist theories can be traced to these formulas. A part of the theories and postulates which presuppose man to be good is liberal. Without being actually anarchist, they are polemically directed against the intervention of the state. Ingenuous anarchism reveals that the belief in the natural goodness of man is closely tied to the radical denial of state and government. One follows from the other, and both foment each other. For the liberals, on the other hand, the goodness of man signifies nothing more than an argument with whose aid the state is made to serve society. This means that society determines its own order, and that state and government are subordinate and must be distrustingly controlled and bound to precise limits. The classical formulation by Thomas Paine says, "Society is the result of our reasonably regulated needs, government is the result of our wickedness." The radicalism vis-à-vis state and government grows in proportion to the radical belief in the goodness of man's nature. Bourgeois liberalism was never radical in a political sense, yet it remains self-evident that liberalism's negation of state and the political, its neutralizations, depoliticizations, and declarations of freedom, have likewise a certain political meaning, and in a concrete situation these are polemically directed against a specific state and its political power. But this is neither a political theory nor a political idea. Although liberalism has not radically denied the state, it has on the other hand neither advanced a positive theory of state, nor on its own discovered how to reform the state, but has attempted only to tie the political to the ethical, and to subjugate it to economics. It has produced a doctrine of the separation and balance of powers, i.e., a system of checks and controls of state and government. This cannot be characterized as either a theory of state or a basic political principle. What remains is the remarkable, and for many certainly disquieting diagnosis, that all genuine political theories presuppose man to be evil, i.e., by no means an unproblematic but a dangerous and dynamic being. This can be easily documented in the works of every specific political thinker. Insofar as they reveal themselves as such, they all agree on the idea of a problematic human nature, no matter how distinct they are in rank and prominent in history. It suffices here to cite Machiavelli, Hobbes, Bossuet, Fichte, as soon as he forgets his humanitarian idealism, Demaitre, Donoso Cortés, H. Taine, and Hegel, who, to be sure, at times also shows his double face. It should be said, nevertheless, that Hegel remains everywhere political in the decisive sense. Those of his writings which concerned the actual problems of his time, particularly the highly gifted work of his youth, the Constitution of Germany, are enduring documentations of the philosophical truth that all spirit is present spirit. This remains visible also through the correctness or incorrectness of Hegel's ephemeral position on historical events of his time. The historical spirit does not reside in Baroque representations or even in romantic alibis. That is Hegel's hic Rhodus, and the genuineness of a philosophy which does not permit the fabrication of intellectual traps under the pretext of apolitical purity and pure non-politics. Of a specifically political nature also is his dialectic of concrete thinking. The often quoted sentence of quantity transforming into quality has a thoroughly political meaning. It is an expression of the recognition that from every domain the point of the political is reached, and with it a qualitative new intensity of human groupings. The actual application of this sentence refers to the economic domain and becomes virulent in the 19th century. The process of such transformation executes itself continuously in the autonomous so-called politically neutral economic domain, and the hitherto non-political or pure matter of fact now turns political. When it reaches a certain quantity, economic property, for example, becomes obviously social, or more correctly political, power. Propriété turns into pouvoir, and what is at first only an economically motivated class antagonism then turns into a class struggle of hostile groups. Hegel also offers the first polemically political definition of the bourgeois. The bourgeois is an individual who does not want to leave the apolitical, riskless private sphere. He rests in the possession of his private property, and under the justification of his possessive individualism, he acts as an individual against the totality. He is a man who finds his compensation for his political nullity in the fruits of freedom and enrichment, and above all, in the total security of its use. Consequently, he wants to be spared bravery and exempted from the danger of a violent death. Hegel has also advanced a definition of the enemy which in general has been evaded by modern philosophers. The enemy is a negated otherness. But this negation is mutual, and this mutuality of negations has its own concrete existence as a relation between enemies. This relation of two nothingnesses on both sides bears the danger of war. This war is not a war of families against families, says Hegel, but between peoples, and hatred becomes thereby undifferentiated and freed from all particular personality. The question is how long the spirit of Hegel has actually resided in Berlin. In any event, the new political tendency which dominated Prussia after 1840 preferred to avail itself of a conservative philosophy of state, especially one furnished by Friedrich Julius Stahl, whereas Hegel wandered to Moscow via Karl Marx and Lenin. His dialectical method became established there and found its concrete expression in a new concrete enemy concept, namely that of the international class enemy, and transformed itself, the dialectical method, as well as everything else, legality and illegality, the state, even the compromise with the enemy, into a weapon of this battle. The actuality of Hegel is very much alive in Georg Lukács. He cites an expression by Lenin which Hegel would have made with reference to the political entity of a warring people instead of a class. Persons, says Lenin, who think of politics as small tricks which at times border on deceit, must be decisively refuted. Classes cannot be deceived. This whole question regarding human nature is not settled by psychological comments on optimism or pessimism. It follows, according to the anarchist method, that only individuals who consider man to be evil are evil. Those who consider him to be good, namely the anarchists, are then entitled to some sort of superiority or control over the evil ones. The problem thus begins anew. One must pay more attention to how very different the anthropological presuppositions are in the various domains of human thought. With methodological necessity, an educator will consider man capable of being educated. A jurist of private law starts with the sentence, "one who is presumed to be good." A theologian ceases to be a theologian when he no longer considers man to be sinful or in need of redemption, and no longer distinguishes between the chosen and the non-chosen. The moralist presupposes a freedom of choice between good and evil. Because the sphere of the political is in the final analysis determined by the real possibility of enmity, political conceptions and ideas cannot very well start with an anthropological optimism. This would dissolve the possibility of enmity, and thereby every specific political consequence. The connection of political theories with theological dogmas of sin, which appear prominently in Bossuet, de Maistre, Bonald, Donoso Cortés, and Friedrich Julius Stahl, among others, is explained by the relationship of these necessary presuppositions. The fundamental theological dogma of the evilness of the world and man leads, just as does the distinction of friend and enemy, to a categorization of men, and makes impossible the undifferentiated optimism of a universal conception of man. In a good world, among good people, only peace, security, and harmony prevail. Priests and theologians are here just as superfluous as politicians and statesmen. What the denial of original sin means socially and from the viewpoint of individual psychology has been shown by Ernst Troeltsch in his Social Teachings of the Christian Church and Groups, and Sellier in many publications about romanticism and romantics, in the examples of numerous sects, heretics, romantics, and anarchists. The methodological connection of theological and political presuppositions is clear, but theological interference generally confuses political concepts, because it shifts the distinction usually into moral theology. Political thinkers such as Machiavelli, Hobbes, and often Fichte presuppose with their pessimism only the reality or possibility of the distinction of friend and enemy. For Hobbes, truly a powerful and systematic political thinker, the pessimistic conception of man is the elementary presupposition of a specific system of political thought. He also recognized correctly that the conviction of each side that it possesses the truth, the good, and the just bring about the worst enmities, finally, the war of all against all. This fact is not the product of a frightful and disquieting fantasy, nor of a philosophy based on free competition by bourgeois society in its first stage, but is the fundamental presupposition of a specific political philosophy. These political thinkers are always aware of the concrete possibility of an enemy. Their realism can frighten men in need of security. Without wanting to decide the question of the nature of man, one may say in general that as long as man is well off, or willing to put up with things, he prefers the illusion of an undisturbed calm, and does not endure pessimists. The political adversaries of a clear political theory will therefore easily refute political phenomena and truths in the name of some autonomous discipline as amoral, uneconomical, unscientific, and above all, declare this, and this is politically relevant, a devilry worthy of being combated. This misfortune occurred to Machiavelli, who, had he been a Machiavellian, would sooner have written an edifying book than his ill-reputed Il Principe. In actuality, Machiavelli was on the defensive, as was also his country, Italy, which in the 16th century had been invaded by Germans, Frenchmen, Spaniards, and Turks. At the beginning of the 19th century, the situation of the ideological defensive was repeated in Germany during the revolutionary and Napoleonic invasions of the French. When it became important for the German people to defend themselves against an expanding enemy armed with a humanitarian ideology, Machiavelli was rehabilitated by Fichte and Hegel. The worst confusion arises when concepts such as justice and freedom are used to legitimize one's own political ambitions and to disqualify or demoralize the enemy. In the shadow of an embracing political decision and in the security of a stable political state organization, law, whether private or public, has its own relatively independent domain. As with every domain of human endeavor and thought, it can be utilized to support or refute other domains. But it is necessary to pay attention to the political meaning of such utilizations of law and morality, and above all, of the word rule or sovereignty of law. First, law can signify here the existing positive laws and law-giving methods which should continue to be valid. In this case, the rule of law means nothing else than the legitimization of a specific status quo, the preservation of which interests particularly those whose political power or economic advantage would stabilize itself in this law. Second, appealing to law can signify that a higher or better law, a so-called natural law or law of reason, is set against the law of the status quo. In this case, it is clear to a politician that the rule or sovereignty of this type of law signifies the rule and sovereignty of men or groups who can appeal to this higher law and thereby decide its content and how and by whom it should be applied. Hobbes has drawn these simple consequences of political thought without confusion and more clearly than anyone else. He has emphasized time and time again that the sovereignty of law means only the sovereignty of men who draw up and administer this law. The rule of a higher order, according to Hobbes, is an empty phrase if it does not signify politically that certain men of this higher order rule over men of a lower order. The independence and completeness of political thought is here irrefutable. There always are concrete human groupings which fight other concrete human groupings in the name of justice, humanity, order, or peace. When being reproached for immorality and cynicism, the spectator of political phenomena can always recognize in such reproaches a political weapon used in actual combat. Still, political thought and political instinct in their purity prove themselves theoretically and practically in the ability to distinguish friend and enemy. The high points of politics are simultaneously the moments in which the enemy is, in concrete clarity, recognized as the enemy. But also vice versa. Everywhere in political history, in foreign as well as in domestic politics, the incapacity or the unwillingness to make this distinction is a symptom of the political end. In Russia, before the revolution, the doomed classes romanticized the Russian peasant as good, brave, the pious Christian mujik. A relativistic bourgeoisie in a confused Europe searched all sorts of exotic cultures for the purpose of making them an object of its aesthetic consumption. The aristocratic society in France before the Revolution of 1789 sentimentalized man who is by nature good and the virtue of the masses. Tocqueville recounts this situation in words whose shuddering tension arises in him from a specific political pathos. Nobody, he says, scented the revolution. It is incredible to see the security and unsuspiciousness with which these privileged spoke of the goodness, mildness, and innocence of the people when 1793 was already upon them. A ridiculous and terrible spectacle. Section 8. Liberalism has changed all political conceptions in a peculiar and systematic fashion. Like any other significant human movement, liberalism too, as a historical force, has failed to elude the political. Its neutralizations and depoliticizations of education, the economy, etc., are, to be sure, of political significance. Liberals of all countries have engaged in politics just as other parties, and have in the most different ways coalesced with non-liberal elements and ideas. There are national liberals, social liberals, free conservatives, liberal Catholics, and so on and so forth. In particular, they have tied themselves to very illiberal, essentially political, and even democratic movements leading to the total state. But the question is whether a specific political idea can be derived from the pure and consequential concept of individualistic liberty. This is to be denied. The negation of the political, which is inherent in every consistent individualism, leads necessarily to a political practice of distrust toward all conceivable political forces and forms of state and government, but never produces on its own a positive theory of state, government, or politics. As a result, there exists a liberal policy in the form of a polemical antithesis against state, church, or other institutions which restrict individual freedom. There exists a liberal policy of trade, church, and education, but absolutely no liberal politics, only a liberal critique of politics. The systematic theory of liberalism concerns almost solely the internal struggle against the power of the state. For the purpose of protecting individual freedom and private property, liberalism provides a series of methods for hindering and controlling the state's and government's power. It makes of the state a compromise, and of its institutions a ventilating system, and moreover it balances monarchy against democracy and vice versa. In critical times, particularly 1848, this led to such a contradictory position that all good observers, such as Lorenz von Stein, Karl Marx, Friedrich Julius Stahl, Donoso Cortés, despaired of trying to find there a political principle or an intellectually consistent idea. In a very systematic fashion, liberal thought evades or ignores state and politics and moves instead in a typical, always recurring polarity of two heterogeneous spheres, namely ethics and economics, intellect and trade, education and property. The critical distrust of state and politics is easily explained by the principles of a system whereby the individual must remain the start and end point in all cases. In case of need, the political entity must demand the sacrifice of life. Such a demand is in no way justifiable by the individualism of liberal thought. No consistent individualism can entrust to someone other than to the individual himself the right to dispose of the physical life of the individual. An individualism in which anyone other than the free individual himself were to decide upon the substance and dimension of his own freedom would be only an empty phrase. For the individual as such, there is no enemy with whom he must enter into a life and death struggle if he personally does not want to do so. To compel him to fight against his will is, from the viewpoint of the private individual, lack of freedom and repression. All liberal pathos turns against repression and lack of freedom. Every encroachment, every threat to individual freedom and private property and free competition is called repression and is eo ipso something evil. What this liberalism still admits of state, government, and politics is confined to securing the conditions for liberty and eliminating infringements on freedom. We thus arrive at an entire system of demilitarized and depoliticized concepts. A few may here be enumerated in order to show the incredibly coherent systematics of liberal thought, which, despite all its reversals, still has not been replaced in Europe today. These liberal concepts typically move between ethics, intellectuality, and economics, trade. From this polarity, they attempt to annihilate the political as a domain of conquering power and repression. The concept of private law serves as a lever, and the notion of private property forms the center of the globe, whose poles, ethics and economics, are only the contrasting emissions from this central point. Ethical or moral pathos and materialist economic reality combine in every typical liberal manifestation and give every political concept a double face. Thus, the political concept of battle in liberal thought becomes competition in the domain of economics and discussion in the intellectual realm. Instead of a clear distinction between the two different states, that of war and that of peace, there appears the dynamic of perpetual competition and perpetual discussion. The state turns into society, on the ethical intellectual side into an ideological humanitarian conception of humanity, and on the other into an economic technical system of production and traffic. The self-understood will to repel the enemy in a given battle situation turns into a rationally constructed social ideal or program, a tendency or an economic calculation. A politically united people becomes, on the one hand, a culturally interested public, and on the other, partially an industrial concern and its employers, partially a mass of consumers. At the intellectual pole, government and power turns into propaganda and mass manipulation, and at the economic pole, control. These dissolutions aim with great precision at subjugating state and politics, partially into an individualistic domain of private law and morality, partially into economic notions. In doing so, they deprive state and politics of their specific meaning. Outside of the political, liberalism not only recognizes with self-evident logic the autonomy of different human realms, but drives them toward specialization and even toward complete isolation. That art is a daughter of freedom, that aesthetic value judgment is absolutely autonomous, that artistic genius is sovereign. All this is axiomatic of liberalism. In some countries, a genuine liberal pathos came to the fore only when this autonomous freedom of art was endangered by moralistic apostles of tradition. Morality became autonomous vis-à-vis metaphysics and religion, science vis-à-vis religion, art, and morality, etc. The most important example of such an autonomy is the validity of norms and the laws of economics. That production and consumption, price formation and market have their own sphere and can be directed neither by ethics, nor aesthetics, nor by religion, nor, least of all, by politics, was considered one of the few truly unquestionable dogmas of this liberal age. With great passion, political viewpoints were deprived of every validity and subjugated to the norms and orders of morality, law, and economics. In the concrete reality of the political, no abstract orders or norms, but always real human groupings and associations rule over other human groupings and associations. Politically, the rule of morality, law, and economics always assumes a concrete political meaning. In this case, the rule of the bourgeoisie. The word repression is used in liberal theory as a reproach against state and politics. This would have been nothing more than a powerless curse word of political debate if it had not been integrated into a large metaphysical and historical system. It gained, thereby, a broader horizon and a stronger moral conviction. The enlightened 18th century believed in a clear and simple upward line of human progress. Progress should, above all, result in the intellectual and moral perfection of humanity. The line moved between 2 points, from religious fanaticism to intellectual liberty, from dogma to criticism, from superstition to enlightenment, from darkness to light. In the first half of the 19th century, 2 symptomatic triple-structured constructions appear: Hegel's dialectical succession, family, civil society, state, and Comte's 3 stages, from theology via metaphysics to positive science. The triple structure weakens the polemical punch of the double-structured liberal antithesis. Therefore, Soon after a period of order, exhaustion, and attempts at restoration, when the battle began again, the simple double-structured antithesis prevailed immediately. Even in Germany, where it was not meant to be warlike, Hegel's triple-structured scheme was pushed aside in the second part of the 19th century in favor of the dual one, domination and association in Gierke, or community and society in Tönnies. The most conspicuous and historically the most effective example of a non-liberal antithesis was formulated by Karl Marx, bourgeoisie and proletariat. This antithesis concentrates all antagonisms of world history into one single final battle against the last enemy of humanity. It does so by integrating the many bourgeois parties on earth into a single order on the one hand, and likewise the proletariat on the other. By so doing, a mighty friend-enemy grouping is forged. Its power of conviction during the 19th century resided above all in the fact that it followed its liberal bourgeois enemy into its own domain, the economic, and challenged it, so to speak, in its home territory with its own weapons. This was necessary because the turning toward economics was decided by the victory of industrial society. The year of this victory, 1814, was the year in which England had triumphed over the military imperialism of Napoleon. The most simple and transparent theory of this historical development is advocated by Albert Spencer. He sees human history as a development from the military feudal to the industrial commercial society. But the first already systematic expression, the treatise On the Spirit of Conquest, had been published in 1814 by Benjamin Constant, the initiator of the whole liberal spirit of the 19th century. In the 18th century, the idea of progress was partially humanitarian, moral, and intellectual. It was a spiritual progress. In the 19th, it became economic, industrial, technological. This mutation was decisive. It was believed that the economy is the vehicle of this very complex development. Economy, trade and industry, technological perfection, freedom, and rationalization were considered allies. Despite its offensive thrust against feudalism, reaction, and the police state, it was judged as essentially peaceful in contrast to warlike force and repression. The characteristic 19th century scheme is thereby formed. Freedom, progress, and reason, in alliance with economy, industry, and technology, expressed as parliamentarianism, against feudalism, reaction, and force, in alliance with state, war, and politics, expressed as dictatorship. The complete inventory of this system of antitheses and their possible combinations is contained in the 1814 treatise by Benjamin Constant. He maintains that we are in an age which must necessarily replace the age of wars, just as the age of wars had necessarily to precede it. Then follows the characterization of both ages. The one aims at winning the goods of life by peaceful exchange, the other by war and repression. This is the savage impulsion, the other, on the contrary, the civilized calculus. Since war and conquest are not procuring amenities and comforts, wars are thereby no longer useful, and the victorious war is also bad business for the victor. Moreover, the enormous development of modern war technology, Constant cites particularly the artillery upon which the technological superiority of the Napoleonic armies rested primarily, made senseless everything which had previously been considered in war heroic, glorious, personal courage, and delight in fighting. According to Constant's conclusion, war had lost every usefulness as well as every attraction. Man, he says, is no longer trained to indulge in it, neither by interest nor by passion. In the past, the warring nations had subjugated the trading peoples. Today, it is the other way around. The extraordinarily intricate coalition of economy, freedom, technology, ethics, and parliamentarianism has long ago finished off its old enemy, the residues of the absolute state and a feudal aristocracy, and with the disappearance of that enemy, it has lost its original meaning. Now, new groupings and coalitions appear. Economy is no longer eo ipso freedom. Technology does not serve comforts only, but just as much the production of dangerous weapons and instruments. Progress no longer produces eo ipso the humanitarian and moral perfection which was considered progress in the 19th century. A technological rationalization can be the opposite of an economic rationalization. Nevertheless, Europe's spiritual atmosphere continues to remain until this very day under the spell of this 19th century historical interpretation. Until recently, its formulas and concepts retained a force which appeared to survive the death of its old adversary. The best example of this polarity of state and society is contained in the theses of Franz Oppenheimer. He declares his aim to be the destruction of the state. His liberalism is so radical that he no longer permits the state to be even an armed office guard. The destruction is effected by advancing a value and passion-ridden definition. The concept of state, he says, should be determined by political means, the concept of society, in essence non-political, by economic means. But the qualifications by which political and economic means are then defined are nothing more than typical expressions of that liberal pathos against politics and state. They swing in the polarity of ethics and economics and unveil polemical antitheses in which is mirrored the 19th century German polemical tension of state and society, politics and economy. The economic way is declared to be reciprocity of production and consumption, therefore mutuality, equality, justice and freedom, and finally nothing less than the spiritual union of fellowship, brotherliness and justice. The political way appears, on the other hand, as a conquering power outside the domains of economics, namely thievery, conquest, and crimes of all sorts. A hierarchical value system of the relation of state and society is maintained. But whereas Hegel's systematized conception of the German state in the 19th century considered it to be a realm of morality and objective reason high above the appetitive domain of egoistic society, the value judgment is now turned around. Society as a sphere of peaceful justice now stands infinitely higher than the state, which is degraded to a region of brutal immorality. The roles are changed. The apotheosis remains. But in actuality, it is not permissible, and neither moral nor psychological, least of all scientific, to simply define by moral qualifications, by confronting the good, the just, and the peaceful with the filthy, evil, rapacious, and criminal politics. With such methods, one could just as well the other way around define politics as the sphere of honest rivalry and economics as a world of deception. The connection of politics with thievery, force, and repression is, in the final analysis, no more precise than is the connection of economics with cunning and deception. Exchange and deception are often not far apart. A domination of men based upon pure economics must appear a terrible deception if by remaining non-political it thereby evades political responsibility and visibility. Exchange by no means precludes the possibility that one of the contractors experiences a disadvantage, and that a system of mutual contracts finally deteriorates into a system of the worst exploitation and repression. When the exploited and the repressed attempt to defend themselves in such a situation, they cannot do so any longer by economic means. Evidently, the possessor of economic power would then consider every attempt to change its power position by extra-economic means as violence and crime, and will seek methods to hinder this. That ideal construction of a society based on exchange and mutual contracts and eo ipso, peaceful and just, is thereby eliminated. Unfortunately, also, usurers and extortioners appeal to the inviolability of contracts and to the sentence pacta sunt servanda. The domain of exchange has its narrow limits and its specific categories, and not all things possess an exchange value. No matter how large the financial bribe may be, there is no money equivalent for political freedom and political independence. In truth, then, State and politics cannot be exterminated. The world will not become depoliticized with the aid of definitions and constructions, all of which circle the polarity of ethics and economics. Economic antagonisms can become political, and the fact that an economic power position could arise proves that the point of the political may be reached from the economic as well as from any other domain. The often quoted phrase by Walter Rathenau, namely that the destiny today is not politics but economics, originated in this context. It would be more exact to say that politics continues to remain the destiny, but what has occurred is that economics has become political and thereby the destiny. It is also erroneous to believe that a political position founded on economic superiority is essentially unwarlike, as Josef Schumpeter says in his Sociology of Imperialisms. Essentially unwarlike is the terminology based on the essence of liberal ideology. An imperialism based on pure economic power will naturally attempt to sustain a worldwide condition which enables it to apply and manage unmolested its economic means. For example, terminating credit, embargoing raw materials, destroying the currencies of others, and so on. Every attempt of a people to withdraw itself from the effects of such supposedly peaceful methods is considered by this imperialism as extra-economic power. Pure economic imperialism will also apply a stronger but still economic, and therefore, according to this terminology, non-political, essentially peaceful means of force. A 1921 League of Nations resolution enumerates as examples economic sanctions and the severance of the food supply from the civilian population. Finally, it has sufficient technological means to bring about violent death. Hence, modern means of annihilation have been produced by enormous investments of capital and intelligence, surely to be used if necessary. For the application of such means, a new and essentially pacifist vocabulary has been created. War is condemned, but executions, sanctions, punitive expeditions, pacifications, protection of treaties, international police, and measures to assure peace remain. The adversary is thus no longer called an enemy, but a disturber of peace, and is thereby designated to be an outlaw of humanity. A war waged to protect or expand economic power must, with the aid of propaganda, then turn into a crusade and into the last war of humanity. This is implicit in the very polarity of ethics and economics, a polarity astonishingly systematic and consistent. But this allegedly non-political and apparently even anti-political system serves existing or newly emerging friend and enemy groupings. It cannot escape the logic of the political.